states have laws like this, restraining, like Texas, which has very liberal gun laws, also does not allow you to hang onto your gun if you have an active restraining order. What's your reaction to the ruling?
My reaction is this is an important statement from the court about what its decision meant 2 years ago in that case that we all talked about, the Bruin case, where Justice Clarence Thomas laid out, I would argue, a new standard for when we can uphold restrictions on gun ownership. And it was a very difficult decision for governments to follow. But I think what the court is saying here today is it is one that you can satisfy. And here's the situation where you can satisfy it. If you are subject to a temporary domestic violence restraining order, then you can temporarily lose this fundamental right. And it is important for the court, in part because lower courts were, I would argue, unsure about how exactly to apply that 2022 case, that Bruin standard. And you saw cases kind of going both ways. And in this case, what the court is saying is, this is the type of situation where, sure, maybe we did not have domestic violence restraining orders at our nation's founding, but we understood that you could disarm people who are dangerous. And therefore, there's enough of a historical underpinning that we can uphold this law. And I think that's really important guidance for lower courts.
Because that whole Bruin case, right, to remind everybody, was the case in New York, right, where in order to open carry a gun in New York, you had to prove that you were facing a threat, right? It couldn't be just general security. You had to prove that you were facing a threat. And the Supreme Court struck that down.
Right.
And so there was a lot of talk about, and it struck it down based on the originalist interpretation of the Constitution, right? There's a lot of talk about, well, what does this mean for all the other laws, particularly domestic violence cases, when there were no domestic violence laws during, the founding of this nation?
Right, right. So speaking of domestic violence and that aspect of it, Scott, what do you make of the role that domestic violence played in this ruling?
Well, I think this ruling is important for the reasons our colleague described, but I think it's significant because this is the first time we've seen this Supreme Court in a long time actually rule in favor of regulation of guns, saying here a domestic violence order in place was valid. Up until now, we've seen a long line of cases where the Supreme Court has said that government regulation of gun ownership is, for the most part, invalid. And here, Justice Roberts explained that the lower courts were mistaken thinking that we only had to go back to whether or not there were regulations at the time our Constitution was passed. He said, our position is not that the law is stuck in amber, if you will, solidified in the time of the Constitution. And that's an important change in the whole line of cases, because up until now, and this is why lower courts were struggling, the Supreme Court seemed to be saying any regulations of ownership of guns is not going to withstand the Second Amendment. And here they are saying no. And by the way, this has an important political impact as well on Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden was banking on the decision of the Supreme Court here striking down that law, because he was then going to use that to try and strike down the law that he was just convicted in. So an important decision by the Supreme Court today, reversing a long line of cases, not reversing, but changing direction, if you will, giving more direction.
Jessica, the actual case is, not to use, it's not a legal term, but it's crazy, right? This is a guy who's accused of assaulting his girlfriend in broad daylight. He's, confronted by a witness. He shoots at the witness. And then after being slapped with a restraining order, there's 5 more shooting incidents that he's involved in. I wonder if, does the nature of this case, it's so egregious, does that have an impact on how the Supreme Court ruled, or it wouldn't really matter?
Well, they're human beings, and I think they can't ignore who he is and what he did. And this was something called a facial challenge. It wasn't an as-applied challenge. He wasn't saying this law cannot be applied only with respect to me. It was this law cannot be applied. And so anytime you have a challenger like this, who frankly is not a particularly sympathetic challenger. I mean, if you want to make it easier for people to possess and purchase guns, he's not your poster child for that. But frankly, I really think what was going on, as we've all just discussed, is the court did come out with this new standard in 2022. You laid out the case well in terms of that New York case where Justice Clarence Thomas said, if you want to have a restriction on gun ownership and possession, then you need to point to something in the history and tradition of our country. And what you saw the Chief Justice say today, I think, is really clarifying how that standard is applied. And he said, you're wrong to think that there has to be, quote, a historical twin. You only need a historical analog. And he says, since the founding of our country, we've always understood that people who pose, a danger to others, they can lose their right to gun ownership. And so there's where I think that word danger, there's where it makes it easier for the court to reach its conclusion because of Rahimi and who he is, and what he did.
Let's bring in CBS News Chief Justice correspondent Jan Crawford, who is in our Washington, D.C. bureau, also watching and awaiting these decisions from the Supreme Court. So Jan, let's talk about Clarence Thomas. And
well, wait, before we go there,
okay.
Vlad, I just have to say, I was listening to Jessica's analysis, and you don't even need me here. I mean, that was just brilliant. And to pick up on what she was saying, and the idea that Rahimi was so dangerous. I mean, the Chief Justice had this great exchange during the oral argument where, he was saying, they were kind of saying like, well, how do you know who's dangerous or not? And the Chief Justice said, well, Rahimi was like running around shooting at people. I think that's a pretty good place to start. So, I mean, yes, I think that's exactly right, that this is a guy who, was literally shooting at people when a credit card got declined. He was shooting across playgrounds. He was, there was no question that he was someone that historically, as Jessica pointed out, the government could take that gun away. So I think that is important, not only to their reasoning, but then the overarching point that this is the kind of law that the government, historically speaking, has been able to say, we can disarm people like here who are dangerous. Now, have you guys talked about Hunter Biden yet?
Scott did, yes.
Okay, yeah, because I think this
ahead.
is not a great day for Hunter Biden. I mean, this could have helped if the case had gone the other way. He could have had a better argument that the government can't disarm people who are drug users or drug addicts. And so I think this decision today, and if Scott's already covered that, I'm sorry.
No, it's
I was
good.
running up here from the set. But if he's already covered that, I think this is Hunter Biden's got a big kind of doing a big sigh right now.
Well, can I ask you then, maybe Jessica, you can also weigh in on this along with Jan and Scott, the rationale that U.S. Circuit Court Judge Corey Wilson noted when he ruled on this, which is that while Mr. Rahimi was hardly a model citizen, you could not look at history as a guide for this law. What was just take us through what his thinking was in that ruling.
Do you want me to do that or Jessica?
Both of you can tackle it.
Well, I mean, after Bruin, a lot of these lower court judges in some of these conservative states like Texas kind of went off on a trip of their own. And they were just striking down all kind of gun laws, saying, like, as Jessica pointed out, there's no historical twin. Like, we went back and looked in the 1800s and the 1700s, and they didn't have this exact law. So, therefore, we're going to strike it down. And that's why today's ruling is so important. Even though it preserves the status quo, it's important guidance for these lower courts, like here and the judge here, who took that 2022 decision too far. And today the court is saying, which the Biden administration had argued very well, by the way, that it doesn't have to be a historical twin, as Jessica pointed out. It's more that you have to look at the traditions and the spirit and the history and the understanding of how it was that, yes, you could disarm people who are dangerous to themselves or to other people. So again, that's why when you look at some of these other laws that have been struck down in the last couple of years by some of these more conservative judges. I think this decision will put the brakes on that. Whether you're talking about felons, the government can keep guns out of the hands of felons. The mentally ill that could be dangerous to themselves or to others unintentionally. Obviously here today, people under domestic violence restraining orders, but also drug addicts, drug abusers, like in the case of Hunter Biden. The government has a compelling interest in keeping guns out of the hands of those types of people as well.
I don't know if anyone's gotten a chance to dip into the dissent, but Justice Thomas was the only dissent here. And Jessica, when you were talking about what he had to say about the Bruin case, I suppose it's not a surprise that he would be the only dissent because it's keeping in line with his argument for the Bruin case as well.
Yes, that's right. And this is something that Jan explained to me very well. And you do have Justice Clarence Thomas, who was obviously the majority opinion author in Bruin. And here, looking very quickly, what he's saying is, you didn't understand what I said in Bruin. I said history and tradition, and I'm looking at either when the Second Amendment was ratified or when the 14th Amendment, maybe we can fast forward to the late 1860s and look at when the 14th Amendment was ratified, which allows the Second Amendment to be applied to the states. And he's saying, I don't see that we had domestic violence restraining orders. This is not within the test that I laid out. You don't understand. You're not applying it correctly. And I think, frankly, based, again, on a very quick read, it looks like this is consistent with the lower court judge's opinion that you were just talking about with Jan and that she helped us all understand here. And so I think if there was going to be a division in this case, that it was going to be this 8-1 division after oral arguments. I will also say, I think, shout out to the Solicitor General, Elizabeth Prelogger, who really helped guide the justices. You could hear this in oral argument, step by step through, okay, I understand we did not have domestic violence restraining orders hundreds of years ago, but this is why it fits very neatly within your test to say somebody like Rahimi can temporarily lose his fundamental right to gun ownership.
Yeah, it's kind of, again, for people who are following these cases, who are just ordinary Americans, who are not lawyers, yes, there was no recorded instances of domestic violence in the 1800s because men who were beating their wives, or perhaps women beating their husbands, that was not seen as an arrestable offense. Anyway, Scott, I wonder what this means in the future. We already talked about it in the context of Hunter Biden and what it could mean for him, but just for the notion that the Supreme Court, in a very rare move, has put a restriction on guns in the United States when over the last couple of decades, we've barely had any. What does that mean what does that set? What kind of precedents is it set?
Well, I think this is that's a great question. I think this is something of a minor earthquake because this is relatively speaking, the first time we've seen the Supreme Court willing to support and to a government regulation on the ownership of guns. Up until now, there's been a long line of decisions invalidating the attempt practically by state or federal government to limit the use of guns, whether it's by felons or drug users or New York State trying to keep people from wearing guns in public, even though they had a law going back to the 19th century. All of these have been invalidated. And now, today, we finally have a decision from the Supreme Court that is, I think, somewhat surprising in that it is putting the brakes and significantly kind of indicating there are limits to gun ownership. And I think a secondary thing, not so much related to guns, is how clearly this Chief Justice really kind of called out Justice Thomas. You were wrong, he said. This is not what I said. And Justice Thomas has hung a lot of his credentials on the Second Amendment. So I think that's a significant statement by Justice Thomas in terms of the relationship of the Supreme Court justice. It says something, I think, really interesting there. But importantly, this is an important new decision putting brakes on gun ownership in the United States.
Scott or Jessica or Jan, whoever wants to talk about this, Vlad, when you talked about new restrictions, I wondered if there's a difference between restricting someone's access to guns versus temporarily taking the right away. This is a case about temporarily removing your right to own a gun. The Bruin case was about restricting your movement with the gun. I mean, you can own it, you can have it in your house, you just have to kind of justify why you need to be walking around with it. And I wonder if, when we look at the laws across the country, if they're under kind of two different buckets because of that, or if, any kind of restriction on gun access kind of all falls under the Second Amendment.
Well, I think you're going to see all kinds of litigation arising from this decision. And I think you're going to see more legislation at the state and city, local level trying to go up on this opinion. As you note, this decision seems to be focused on temporary restriction, and that's all it is. So I think we'll see more state and local governments try and go off on justifying more temporary restrictions, and we're going to see a lot more litigation that will ultimately end up at the Supreme Court again.
Jan, the Biden campaign has responded to this ruling, saying in part, quote, "There's only one candidate in this race fighting to save lives from gun violence, and that is Joe Biden." So a political statement there in the wake of this legal ruling. But could we, is this something that people, I think at this point, people know that Democrats generally favor greater gun restrictions and Republicans favor fewer? Is this going to have any kind of impact on the campaign?
To the extent that the Supreme Court does, yes, or gun rights. But, obviously, Trump's 3 appointees support this law. And, when you look back to the decision that they had last week, striking down the ban on bump stocks as something that it said that the ATF couldn't do, that Congress had to do that. That was Donald Trump who pushed that and told his Justice Department to ban bump stocks. So I think gun rights always is going to be a big issue, to your point, and people assume Democrats have a certain position on it and Republicans don't want gun restrictions. It's a little harder when you start actually looking at what the facts are coming out of the court right now. But the court, of course, is going to be a big issue in the election, as it should. I think some of these justices are getting older. The next president obviously could get 1 or 2 possible appointments. So it was a big issue in the last one. And the one before that, we saw when Trump was in, he got 3. So we'll see in November if it makes a difference this time. But I do think on guns, it's important to keep in mind, when the Supreme Court said there's a Second Amendment right to have a gun, that was the earthquake, and for self-defense. And what happened then was that, but people are like, you saw kind of across the country, like, well, really, what does that really mean? And some of the lower courts, the Supreme Court believed, weren't taking that seriously, that this is a protected right, a fundamental right under the Constitution. And so the case we had 2 years ago was in some ways a reaction to that, the Bruin case, where the court was saying, like, listen, man, we meant this is serious. We mean the Second Amendment is the real deal, and you guys need to start taking it seriously. In that case, though, and that's why I don't think today is a surprise at all, and I don't think Justice Thomas has been reprimanded by the Chief Justice, because in that case, Justice Kavanaugh wrote separately, Justice Barrett wrote separately to say, as the court said in its original Heller decision written by Justice Scalia, this does not mean that there's not a role for the government in regulating guns or banning certain types of weapons. So the buckets that we look at are who can own guns, where can they possess them, dangerous places, sensitive places, some of those are gun laws, or what kind of weapons. There's a big case right now we're waiting to hear if the court's going to take from Illinois on an assault weapons ban. So that's more like the bump stocks. But they're all analyzed under that second kind of amendment rubric, which you guys were just talking about a couple minutes ago.
Dan, we talk about this court and often call it a conservative court.
Which it is.
So in relation to like how they have ruled when it comes to the last, several gun-related cases that they've taken up, are they sort of across the board, or can you say, yes, they are in line with conservative thinking?
Well, you know, that suggests that they're outcome oriented, which I don't actually think they are. I mean, this is still a real court, despite what some people would argue otherwise. You know, they really believe this court, after Heller, the law says you have a Second Amendment right to own a gun under the Constitution. That's what the framers understood it to mean. That's what the meaning was. That's what it is today. So then we as society have to figure out what laws can we pass that are reasonable. And the Second Amendment is no different than the first in that regard, the court has explained. Yes, we have a right to free speech, but that doesn't mean we can just go and, you know, shout all kind of things, issue threats. You know, you don't have a free speech right to say, you know, I'm going to go kill you. Or the fire in the crowded theater is the main example. And the same is true for the Second Amendment. Just because you have a right to own a gun doesn't mean there's not a role for the government in passing reasonable gun regulations. And that's what the court, some of the justices said 2 years ago, and that's, again, what we're seeing today. And that's not surprising because when they announced that big Second Amendment ruling in Heller, that was the major earthquake. When you announce something like that, it takes time to sort things out and figure out what the parameters are, what the outer boundaries are. And I think today what we saw so clearly is this is a court where you had 8 justices agreeing that, yes, the government has a role in regulating gun possession, and the government has a role in taking the weapons out of the hands of people who are dangerous.
All right. Jessica Levinson, Scott Frederickson, Jan Crawford. What brilliant analysis all three of you provided for us and our audience. We so appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right. Texas is recovering from the first named storm of the season. We're going to talk about Alberta's impact with our correspondent on the ground in hard-hit Corpus Christi. That's coming up next. Stay with us.
Washington is the seat of power. National security, foreign policy, global economics, every story comes through Washington in some way. We bring some of the most powerful voices in America to the table. We don't just ask the questions, you have to go deeper. We try to understand what's at the heart of the issue we're talking about, to then come forward with solutions.
Face the Nation on CBS.
The justices ruled that Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution.
In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, uncertainty sets in for some students of color.
Affirmative action really gave us an equal opportunity.
CBS Reports explores the historic decision and what it means for those chasing an opportunity to change their lives.
I knew that college was the ticket to break this cycle.
The end of affirmative action, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Okay, let's go.
You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going.
The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We are about to see American weapons in the hands of Mexican cartels.
A gun pipeline to Mexico.
We are arming the cartels.
100%, no doubt about it.
Happening right under our noses.
Who's doing something about this? Nobody.
A CBS Reports exclusive.
Most Americans have no idea that we are effectively arming the enemy next door.
This is the story the American people need to know.
Arming cartels, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides, Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
We're tracking 2 new storms near Florida and Mexico as communities along the Gulf Coast deal with major flooding from Tropical Storm Alberto. That was the first named storm of the season, which weakened after making landfall in Mexico yesterday. Dave Malkoff has been tracking the storm this week from Corpus Christi, Texas, and joins us now. Dave, it looks even worse than it did yesterday when we spoke to you. What's the state of the flooding there in Corpus Christi?